We're going to apply our dust coat here. Notice the angle of the airbrush relative to the part that's being painted. The angle here serves two purposes. Number one, it blows any remaining dust away, and number two, it applies a very fine coat of paint which will act as a barrier coat for any further coats of lacquer paint. If your spray consistency begins to change as you are painting, add a drop of thinner to your paint cup. You will know this is happening if you have to adjust the volume control during spraying. You want this dust coat to be very, very light. Lacquer-based paints dry very quickly, so go back to your first part and start the process again, this time increasing the volume of paint coming out of the airbrush by a small amount. For spray cans, you must be doubly cautious because they put out a fixed volume of paint regardless of your technique. Though you don't have to worry about the paint attacking the plastic, the paint will build up very rapidly and run if you don't hold your part far enough away from the nozzle. Check the manufacturer's instructions on the paint can to determine the nozzle to part distance. The next logical step is tackling those engines to make them come alive. Basic engine assembly and seam removal is similar to the rest of the model. Remember that your exhaust stacks in real life were either cast or welded items and therefore had seams. Nevertheless, you still want to tone the kit seams down a bit. Don't forget, drill out those exhaust stacks too. In order to liven up the engine, we're going to add just a little bit of detail that hasn't been molded in already. In order to add the detail, we'll just use a piece of kit sprue and turn it on our Dremel tool. Once I remove my turned part from the Dremel tool, I merely drill a little hole for a plastic mounting pin in the part, and I drill a corresponding hole in the side of the Merlin engine casing. Although I don't know what that part is in the picture, I added it because it looked like an interesting piece of detail. My next step is to drill some additional locating holes so that I can mount a little bit of extra tubing and wire just in order to dress the engine up and make it look more interesting. We'll go ahead and finish drilling some holes, but before we actually mount the wiring and plumbing detail, we'll paint the engine first. Merlin engines for Royal Air Force aircraft were usually gloss black with unpainted steel bolts. To break up the monotony of the overall black, I will dry brush with Floquil Old Silver and shade with dark brown pastels. Engine exhausts are painted dead flat black, oversprayed with a light dusting of rust, shaded with burnt Sierra, and then burnt sienna for a realistic appearance. Then we can add lengths of wire for some extra detail. The monogram B-17 engine, although molded in one piece, contains a wealth of detail, and we'll use some careful painting to bring out that detail. The Hasegawa Zero engine is a kit in itself and requires only a little extra attention to add some detail. We'll add that detail once the engine has been painted. I painted the Pratt & Whitney engines on the B-17 with a lacquer-based paint. Therefore, in order to add some detail to the fins, I can add a wash with enamel-based paint. And this is how it works. Load your brush up with just a little bit of black, and then Dip your loaded paintbrush into thinner, touch it to the cooling fin, and capillary action will draw it into the recessed areas. And while we're at it, let me remind you that you do not want to try to put lacquer paint over enamel paint. It'll eat the enamel paint. On the big radials, such as this Nakajima Sakai engine modeled by Hasegawa, you must turn your attention to the seam on the cylinder cooling fins. We are talking tedious here, but if you intend to display your engine, the seams on the cylinders will definitely detract from the overall appearance of the model. Remove your seams just like you would on any other part, but you can restore the cooling fin detail by running a razor saw right along the cooling fin. Clean it up with sandpaper after you're finished. The engine on the Japanese Zero will receive much the same treatment as on the B-17's engines, with the exception that the cylinder fins and the crankcase are black. In order to bring out the detail in these real black cylinders, I'm rubbing them down with Artist's aluminum powder, which is available at any art store. We'll simulate the ignition wires with fine solder that's usually available at an electronic supply store. Although it may not be accurate, we're going to go ahead and leave the ignition wires silver because they look kind of good. Before we finish our engine, let's give it a coat of clear flat. Engines were hardly ever clean, so let's try a technique I learned from master car modeler Pat Covert. Mix black pastel powder in some glass cleaner like Windex and wash the completed engine. It may take a couple of washes, but again, be careful not to overdo it. And here's the completed engine, grime and all. Revell's range of 1/32nd scale World War II aircraft, of which the Mosquito is one example, all featured removable cowlings. However, due to the limitations of the molding process, the cowling pieces were relatively thick. To get around this, you can vacuform a new part using the old as a master pattern. If you do not already own a vacuform machine, they're really quite simple to make. Mine is plexiglass with a car speaker grill as the platen. A hole in the box accepts an adapter from the vacuum cleaner. These two pieces of 1/4 inch plywood are held together with wing nuts. The friction holds the plastic firmly in place. My total investment was about $1.50. The rest was scrap. In order to prepare your part for vacuforming, you may need to sand out any excess rivet detail. Here, I'm drilling a hole next to this inlet so that the air suction will pull the plastic down over this protrusion. Finally, you want to mount your master on some clay or Play-Doh so that when you put it on the platen, the plastic will have sufficient distance to be pulled down over the part. Before you actually vacuform, spray your master pattern with some mold release agent, which is available at your local auto parts store. Place your machine next to a heat source. In my case, I'm going to use my kitchen stove. Start melting your plastic. And once you notice it to start to droop, quickly place the plastic over the part and start the vacuum cleaner. The plastic will be sucked down over the mayo mold. Once completed, allow it to cool just for a few seconds. Remove the part from the mold, trim the edges, or just trim the edges using the part as a guide. Voila, there's your completed piece. You will have some scrap plastic left over from the vacuum forming process. Cut the plastic into 3/32nd inch wide strips to simulate reinforcing ribs. Using your references as a guide, glue the strips in place. Be sparing with the glue so that you don't melt the plastic. Once dried, Use your references once more to drill the holes for the fasteners that were used on real aircraft to hold the cowling and other panels to the airframe. Voila! A realistically thin cowling. Now, set the part aside for painting later. The detail I've spoken of is really just a mere fraction of that what you're able to do. You can lower flaps, move the flying surfaces, open up panels. The possibilities for personalizing your aircraft are really only limited to the amount of time and effort you want to spend.